Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Matt here. Today I'm going to be doing a review on the Scopemate S18 scope camera here. I've been using this for quite some time. I received it in the winter, so I wanted to really put it through its paces and test it quite in depth before I made this video. I want to do sort of a more comprehensive review on this camera because I think a lot of people are interested in it, and I've had a lot of people ask me questions about it, so I know there is some interest, and I think because of that this video is probably going to be a little bit longer. So I just want to mention that I always index my timelines, so if there's any particular feature or subject matter you want to just skip forward to, it should be very easy to do that. I think it's also important to keep in mind that I tested this from the perspective of a PRS style competitor, and that's pretty much what I am. I shoot a lot of PRS style matches, and I have also a very busy schedule because I'm basically shooting a match or two every weekend, so I don't have dedicated time to test gear. I basically run gear in matches when I'm testing it to see how it performs to my needs. So some features in here I didn't even test because they're a lot more geared towards, say, hunting and things like that. And some of the features that I may like or don't like is very heavily affected by the fact that I am a PRS competitor. So just keep that in mind as I go through the video. I also do have my Triggercam here, which is a very popular scope camera, and I know a lot of people are interested in getting scope cameras these days because it doesn't only make for great content, but it's also great for training. However, the Triggercam, which I would consider the industry standard for sort of, currently the best scope camera they can buy, this comes with a pretty heavy price tag, where the Scopemate S18 comes at a much cheaper price point, so it's a lot more accessible to some people, and that makes it a lot more enticing. So people want to know if it's worth it and all that, so we'll get into that. I also have one here on my scope right now, just for demonstration purposes later, but I also have this one here, and we'll talk about why I have multiple units and things like that as we go along. First, let's take a look at what comes with the Scopemate when you purchase it. So it comes in a box, pretty nice box. And it comes with a pouch. This is not microfiber, it's more like a felt, so it's not as good for actually cleaning lenses and stuff. User manual, which is actually quite good. The English is a little ESL, but it gets the point across and you know what to do without any ambiguity, so it's a half decent user manual. It comes with your hex driver, which is actually the same size as the Triggercam, funny enough. You have the shims for installing the camera onto a scope. It comes with 3 of them, but one of them right now is under this scope camera. So yeah, 3 shims, charging cable, which is USB-C. Yeah, USB-C. And then it comes also with these 3 large, basically oversized rubber bands, which they say you can use to help space out even smaller diameter scopes if you want to help mount your camera that way. I would say these would really have to be a last resort. I wouldn't recommend using rubber bands to mount a scope camera. And then lastly, you have a little pouch of a few spare parts. You have 2 spare screws for the clamp, which is actually very nice to have, and 2 spare gaskets or O-rings for the battery compartment, which is like a threaded cap. So that's actually kind of nice too. I think it's also important to start off explaining my relationship with Scopemate and the company. I am not sponsored by Scopemate by any means, and they did not provide this camera to me for free. They did, however, reach out to me, and that's how I found out about them. Again, way back in the winter. I think it was actually back in 2023. They reached out to me and said, "Hey Matt, we watched your video comparing the Triggercam to the Tacticam at the time, and we implemented a lot of the things you wish Triggercam had done in this new scope camera," which again is this one here, the S18. Would you be interested in trying one? And I thought that was really awesome because you have to understand, I get a ton of emails from companies. I would say average probably 1 or 2 a day, asking if I want to review product. All of them are the same. Hey, we'll send you whatever for free. We want you to review it. You review it, you can keep it, whatever. And I ghost 99.9% of them. This one was different because they addressed me by name first off, and secondly, they actually watched my video to mention some features that they implemented in the camera. So I thought that was really cool, completely different than what I normally got. So I said, sure. It, again, was not for free. I paid, I believe it was just over $200 for it, which is at a discount from their regular price, but it wasn't for sale regularly yet. They just said, you know, this is what we want to charge you for it. And then they sent me one. And since the first unit I got, I've gone through 4 units, 4. Now, this one here is the second one, and this one here that is in my hands is the 4th one. However, it's not because any of them were defective. So keep that in mind. I'll talk about why I've gone through 4 units of these, but I did initially pay for it. And then because it was sort of still in R&D at the time, we had a lot of back and forth. I don't know how long the email chain is now, but dozens of emails back and forth as I was testing it. They would change some things and then, you know, send me some things. So I just wanted to put that out there. They did offer me discount codes and an affiliate link and revenue sharing, which again, a lot of these companies do offer people, and I declined it because that's not what I'm about. I don't use this channel to generate revenue, and I don't care about, you know, the discount codes are usually just for the company to track how much business they're getting through a certain YouTuber, obviously. So I didn't really want that. If you're really desperate for a discount code, I know there are other videos already reviewing this camera that probably have discount codes. But again, I didn't want to be part of that. I don't want to be associated with any company like that. So I declined that, and I said, you know, I paid for this. I'm going to give it an honest review. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's start talking about the actual camera and the features and stuff. Just like the Triggercam versus Tacticam video that I did a few years ago, I'm going to start with the 4 features that are most important to me in a scope camera like this, and then we'll talk about sort of all the other features afterwards. So the 4 main features that are important to me are going to be the image focus or reticle focus on these cameras, the glass clarity, so the actual pane of glass that you're looking through when this is mounted on your scope, the video output quality, and lastly, if there's any image crop or zoom to the final video output that the camera produces. So first, going to the reticle focus. Does it have it? Yes. So it's already a win because the Tacticam didn't have it, so you had to use the diopter in your scope, and that was definitely not ideal. This Scopemate S18 does have a reticle focus external on the body, which is this knob right here that you can turn. The fact that it's external will make some people really happy, and some people might not like it. It just totally depends on what you use this camera for. After using the Triggercam for many, many matches, I have decided that I actually prefer this focus adjustment to be internal or hidden underneath the cap. So the Triggercam, this smaller cap on the top here, underneath there is your focus wheel. I really like that. Simply because you might accidentally bump this during a PRS style match. If you're walking around, you know, stage to stage, sometimes you have to do a little bit of a hike, and my rifle is brushing up against gear and stuff, so you could easily spin this and then have just a bunch of unusable footage. However, if you're using this more in a static discipline off the bench or whatever, F class, this would be probably pretty nice to have because you don't have to remove a cap every time you want to refocus the camera. Also, people that are using this as a training aid, if you're putting this on students' scopes, you know, multiple scopes a day, you can take it off one scope, putting it on another, and just quickly refocus the camera without having to, again, take off that cap. So again, take it or leave it, totally up to you, but it is external. You'll notice that this one on the scope doesn't have a mark on it, and it comes like that, completely blank, which again, I think they could have improved upon. So I took a scribe and I just made a line on this one here. So when it's focused to my reticle, I just remember the position of where the line is. Throughout the day, if I'm shooting a match, I can just quickly glance at it and make sure it hasn't moved. It's just a witness mark basically, so I can keep track and make sure it's not being bumped. So that was sort of my solution to it. Also, this brings us to the reason why I went through the first unit. So the very first Scopemate S18 they sent me, they didn't have, again, it was a really early version of it, and they didn't have the iOS app ready, and I use an iPhone. So I was just checking out the camera and playing with it, and I was just spinning this thing to see how it felt. And they designed this thing so it doesn't have a limiter on the extreme ends of the focus adjustment, which means I kept spinning it and never stopped. And I thought, oh, that's weird. It has a crazy amount of adjustment in it. Well, turns out when I went to go back, it was disengaged from the gear or whatever inside. So that's why I went through the first unit. So I had to send that back, and then they sent me this one, which is the second unit I went through. Again, that was kind of my fault. I still think they should have designed a limiter inside somehow, but they still haven't, because in the manual, there's a big warning that says, do not just screw this around. Make sure you're using your app to focus the reticle. It's probably like a worm gear and just went off the edge or something. So that's good to keep in mind, but that's the number 1 unit. Again, that's I had to send it back and get number 2. We'll talk about why. Again, I went through 4 of these in total as I go through the video. All right, now let's talk about the glass clarity of the camera. So the actual lens you're looking through when this thing is mounted on a scope. So you mount this thing on your scope, it will redirect some light into the camera to capture the video footage, obviously, and then the remaining light will go back into your eye so you can actually use the scope as normal. But this piece of glass that you're looking through does have some bearings on your experience using the scope camera, because if it's really bad and really dark, it's not going to be very good. After I busted the first unit and they sent me the second unit, I finally got the app, put it on my scope, and immediately noticed that this glass was very dark. So that's, again, this second one here. I'll put a video on screen right now holding this second unit up versus the third and fourth unit, which had much better glass. So I complained to them, I said, listen, this glass, it's so dark, I'm not going to compete with it. The Triggercam has very good glass, and I compete with this often. It does make the image slightly darker, but it still retains a lot of brightness, and the detail you can see through the Triggercam is still good enough, in my opinion, where you can compete at a very high level. It's not ideal. Anytime you put another piece of glass behind your, multi-$1,000 optic, you're going to be taking light away from it. But this one was way too dark for my needs. So again, if you're just making fun videos, totally fine. But if you're trying to compete at a fairly high level, I was completely unusable. So I said, listen, it's not going to work. So they sent me a third unit, which I don't have. This is the fourth unit, keep in mind, but they sent me a third unit, which was much better, much better. In fact, the improvement was astounding. I don't know how they went from quite dark to pretty darn good. In fact, beside the Triggercam, I'll show you on the video, it actually is about the same. In fact, I would say the brightness it retains through this lens or through the whole system is quite good. So that was a really good thing to see. I am a little bit concerned about the consistency unit to unit, because I don't know if they replaced their entire inventory with the better glass. It would kind of suck if you bought one expecting the glass I have in this unit and you got the glass that was in one of the earlier versions they sent me. I have no idea, but I would hope that they did upgrade the glass for all the units going forward, because it's actually quite good. Now, brightness is one issue, which again, this one is pretty good, but reflections and the coatings they put on the glass is an entirely different issue. So the Triggercam, again, in my opinion, is unmatched in terms of controlling the brightness and reflections. It's very rare that I have a bad reflection in the Triggercam when using it behind the scope. Whereas this one, occasionally, if the light is really coming in at a bad angle, I'll see some reflection in the lens, but it's not too bad. You'll see a few reflections, but it's like a green tint because of the coatings, but it's definitely more noticeable than the Triggercam. But it's still, I think for the price, it's not bad at all, and it's very usable because I've competed with this camera a couple times now. All right, now let's talk about the video quality of the video output that you get from the Scopemate S18. It can be very good. I will say, originally I was testing this mostly on rimfire, because rimfire is my main discipline and I shoot a lot of rimfire PRS matches, and I wasn't quite impressed. Then I used it on a centerfire match and I was actually blown away. In fact, the first centerfire match I shot with this, I never made a YouTube video for, so no one's seen the footage publicly, but I ran it again at Alderbrook, and that video is live on my channel, and you can see side by side, because my friend was running my Triggercam and I was running the S18. It produced some pretty stellar video for centerfire, which I was very happy about. Again, this has a 2.7K sensor in it, whereas the Triggercam has a 4K sensor in it. So the Triggercam, you're paying more for a better sensor. You're going to get a little bit better video, obviously. The colors in the S18 are a lot more dull, not in a good way. I think the sensor is just not as good. I really like how the Triggercam image comes up, and often when I'm editing my videos in post, I don't have to change the Triggercam. Whereas in the Alderbrook video, I did have to enhance the colors in the S18, so it didn't look strangely dull compared to the rest of the video. But it kind of proves that you definitely can get good video footage out of this. And the 2.7K sensor is pretty good. Okay, so why did rimfire produce worse video for me than centerfire? Well, it's all about the parallax error. So a side effect of improper parallax is a blurrier image, and the closer distances, which you're usually shooting rimfire in, it has much more severe parallax error in a optical system like a rifle scope. It's just the way it works. And you can kind of see that on how much travel is dedicated to the closer distances on your parallax adjustment. So if I'm all the way down to 10 yards here, to go up to, let's say 200 yards on my parallax adjustment, it's more than 180 degree travel in the parallax knob. From 200 to infinity, it's like, I don't know, 15 degrees, 10 degrees. So your parallax error at closer distances is much more severe. And this camera doesn't handle out of parallax image well at all, because this focus adjustment just focuses the reticle to the camera, similarly like how the diopter focuses the reticle to your eye. And then all the other footage in terms of its clarity is based on, I guess, a little bit of autofocus in the camera, which the Scopemate might not have any, and your parallax setting on your scope. And that's why at the beginning of this video, I mentioned this camera would be fine for people who can be hooked up to a live feed of what this camera is doing through its Wi-Fi connection, because before you shoot, you can just make sure that everything is nice and clear and then film what you need to film. Whereas as a PRS competitor, once this thing is focused to my reticle, I'm not connecting this to my phone, because throughout the day at a match, I'm just shooting the match. I'm concentrating on my performance at the match, not the scope camera. Oftentimes in a PRS match, you don't have the ability to dial in perfect parallax for every target. You're shooting multiple target distances in a stage, and you are constricted in your par time, anywhere from 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So oftentimes we have to make compromises and take shots that are slightly out of parallax and out of focus, and this camera handles it very poorly. Again, for centerfire distances, it's not a huge deal, because for centerfire, a lot of people just leave their parallax setting at like 750 or infinity and just they don't touch it all day, and it's fine because those distances are so far and there's not much parallax error in both like actual parallax in your reticle and image blur. It's not an issue for centerfire. For rimfire, it's a much bigger issue, and this thing is very sensitive to it. The Triggercam, for some reason, is not as sensitive to out of focus image because of an improper parallax adjustment. I don't know if it has a little bit of autofocus built into it. I have no idea how it works. It's just what I notice, and it's very apparent in the video footage that these cameras produce. So I did a little bit of testing on these two cameras side by side. I have two Razor Gen 3s, and I had them mounted side by side, simultaneously testing this. And when the image is slightly blurry, where I would still accept it to take a shot at a match, the S18 produces very blurry footage. I would say you can't really even tell what's going on, but the Triggercam controls it pretty well, where it's quite similar to what I actually see in my eyes. So it's definitely better in that regards. Again, it just depends how you use the camera. But that's something that I noticed with the S18 very apparently. At first, I didn't know if it was me doing something different, but when I compared them side by side, again, on two Razor Gen 3s at the exact same time, I confirmed it. Both of these scopes are Razor Gen 3s, so same glass, same scope, same everything. The only difference is the cameras that are on. That tree line is about 680 yards away. And what I want to demonstrate here is both of the Razors now are set to the proper parallax setting at around 700 yards for a nice clear image on that tree line, looking at that birch tree. And it's obviously clear to me when I'm seeing through the scope. But oftentimes in a PRS match, you can't shoot with perfect parallax for all your targets. You sort of have to pick something in between. If you're shooting multiple target distances, targets from 500 to 1,000, you might set it at 700 and call it good, right? So you don't always have the perfect parallax setting. For that tree line at around 680 yards, if I dial my parallax close, right there. They're both set to 400 yards. So again, not perfect parallax setting, but good enough where I would take that shot at a match. Again, I bet you the Triggercam is gonna handle that out of focus image a little bit better than the Scopemate. So that's just one thing I noticed. And you'll notice the reticle should be in focus because I've focused both of the cameras to the reticle. Definitely something to note. It might be a big deal for some and it might not be a big deal to others, but make sure, the first thing you have to do is make sure that the camera is focused to your reticle, most importantly, and for the best picture quality, always dial in your parallax perfectly with the S18. Another thing to consider is glare in the video footage. The Triggercam hardly ever get weird glare or you know, like bright spots in the video footage, but when light comes in at a bad angle on the S18, again, you'll get this very bright spot depending where the light is coming in, and it's something that's unavoidable depending on where the sun is relative to you. And I'll put up a little video again side by side with the Triggercam at the exact same time. You can see the glare in the S18 video compared to the Triggercam. And with the light coming in, sometimes you get some bad reflections in the video footage. So we'll just see how it handles that right now. And what I'm doing right now, looking through the cameras, is seeing how much reflection I see off this back glass, because that can be quite distracting sometimes when you're shooting a match and you see reflections coming off this black glass at you. It can definitely take away from your sight picture. So the Scopemate right now, I'm seeing a lot of reflection. It's not bad, it's well controlled, and it's a green tint because of the coating, but I can still see the reflection of my own face. Like I can see my glasses and my cheek on reflecting off this lens. If I go to the Triggercam, I barely see it. So the coatings on the Triggercam are quite good. I've always really liked the glass that you look through. The Scopemate, it's actually pretty good. It's not bad at all, way better than the Tacticam. The Tacticam, at some points, depending on how the light was hitting it, it would be like a mirror. And you can like see your own eyeball, which is bad. It's much better than the Tacticam, but not quite at the same level as the Triggercam. Okay, so let's talk about the crop or zoom in the video output of these cameras. One thing I really didn't like about the Triggercam was the amount of fixed optical zoom built into the camera, because it crops a lot of your video footage from what you would normally see in the field of view of your scope. So how I tested this was I set the magnification in my Razor Gen 3 so that in the reticle it was 10 mils on the left and 10 mils on the right, touching the edges, and then 10 mils on the bottom and 10 mils on the top in the reticle. So again, 20 mils horizontally, 20 mils vertically, showing perfectly centered, so that I could record some video and see how much of my reticle it cropped and then calculate how much of the image it cropped. So the Triggercam, I calculated about 48 to 49% crop vertically, which means because the image is a rectangle, so it crops more vertically than it does horizontally. So it's about a 50% crop vertically, which is very heavy. I think the reason they do this is because for hunters that generally use lower magnification, it's better because it gives you a little bit more of a zoomed in image so you can see what they're doing. As a PRS competitor making content, I would rather there be no crop so I can show the entire field of view of my sight picture and show what I'm seeing on camera. So that's just, again, as a PRS competitor, I'd rather there be zero crop. So there's about 50% crop vertically, I have some notes here, and then 8% crop horizontally. So that means if you wanted to show a lot more of your vertical field of view, you could just turn this camera 90 degrees and you could do that. But we'll talk about why I can't do that. I have to run these cameras at a very specific position on my scopes for competition, but that's an option. Going on to the Scopemate S18, again, I did the same test with the 20 mils of reticle showing, and I calculated this to be about a 36% vertical crop, so substantially less than the Triggercam, but still some crop with the full field of view, so no crop showing horizontally. So again, if you wanted to show your entire vertical field of view in your scope, you could just turn this thing 90 degrees and you could do that, which is pretty awesome. However, this is where the third unit they sent me comes into play. So keep in mind, the first one they sent me, I busted the focus wheel, my own fault. The second one they sent me, the glass was too dark, I didn't like it, that's this one here. And the third one they sent me, which I don't have on the table because I sent it back, is because of the crop. So they sent me what they call the rectangle version. So they have two different camera sensors in their cameras, and they sent me a rectangle version which has a very heavy crop. It was even more, slightly more than the Triggercam, and the Triggercam is right on the limit of what I would want to use. So I told them it was just way too much crop. So they said, that's fine, we'll send you this one, which is what they call the circle version. Yeah, so the rectangle version has a lot of crop. Their circle version has a lot less crop, which is the numbers I gave you previously with the 36% vertically. Again, a little bit concerning in terms of the consistency unit to unit, because I looked on their website now that these are actually for sale, and they have a product page for it, and you can't choose rectangle or circle version. So I don't know what you're going to get. I would hope it's not the one with an extreme amount of zoom, unless you want that. But I guess you could ask the company before ordering and just making sure that you have the circle version and not the super zoomed in rectangle version. I also want to mention quickly, again, talking about the consistency in these unit to unit. When I mount these on my camera, and I'll put in some video here, the same scope, the reticle in the video shifts. So I don't know if it must be just how the camera is mounted in these is just in a slightly different position, where you'll see more or less of, it's the same crop, but the reticle is either higher or lower in the video footage, which again, just a little bit of inconsistencies. I've used 3 different Triggercam units before, just borrowing from friends when I'm making certain videos, and they've all been very close in terms of the reticle placement on the same scope. So a little bit more consistencies. Obviously the tolerances for building these S18s are sloppier than the Triggercam, and again, to be expected when we talk about price, but it's just something to note. When you dial your scope, by the way, on any of these cameras, you can actually see a reticle move a little bit in the video footage, but for the test, I made sure I didn't touch any settings on the scope. I just literally put this camera on it, took it off, and then put this camera on it, and I saw the reticle in the video is at a different position. All right, so let's talk about general feel and quality of these cameras. They work okay, and they must be robust enough, because I have used these cameras in rain, and it's held up. I haven't had any issues with water damage or anything like that, so they can handle a little bit of rain, but they just feel a little janky, if I'm totally honest. The material, you can tell when you, especially when you open the battery, which I'll show you in a second, but it's just like pot metal or whatever. And then where the metal meets the plastic, the seam is not very clean. And then this plastic, it just doesn't feel it feels kind of like brittle, if that makes any sense. The battery compartment, if I'm quiet, I'll let you hear it. Like it feels really bad. It feels like sandpaper. Just the threads on this sort of like pot metal. It's not very good. Talk about the battery later. And then inside there, hopefully you can see, it just doesn't look super clean. And again, talking about inconsistencies, the battery cap on this unit is actually not too bad. The threads, I'll bring my mic here so you can hear it. They're a lot smoother. Whereas this one here just, yeah, just is not, it doesn't feel good at all. Doesn't really matter if it's functional, but again, it just adds to the overall experience and general feeling of quality. The feeling of the buttons is also not very consistent. These all feel the same, but I have one button on this unit here that's quite stiff. Like all these buttons, you can sort of feel it click, which is kind of nice. This one here, it doesn't really click. It still contacts and works, but it just doesn't feel great. But because they use plastic and stuff, the overall weight of the Triggercam is much lighter. I have some notes here. The S18 is about 44% lighter at 253 grams than the Triggercam. So it's substantially lighter. This thing is all aluminum and quite heavy, and it's 446 grams. So again, 44% lighter is very substantial, and it's actually quite nice because it doesn't affect your rifle weight or balance as substantially. Because some of the features they implemented on the S18, it is substantially bulkier. It's just a bulkier unit. You can see here side by side on the top, it's wider, it's taller, Almost in every dimension, it's just a bigger, beefier unit. So when it's on your scope, it's really in your face. So I'll show you that there. This is what you would be looking at when you're using it on your scope. There's a lot of material that is closer to your face. It cuts out a lot of your sort of peripheral vision, if you will. And it takes a lot of getting used to having this much material closer to your face. So, and it looks just ginormous on a scope. The battery compartment is probably my biggest beef with it. I like the fact that it has a replaceable battery. We'll talk about that, which is great. But because of the sort of like bulge on the side of the camera here, it adds something to be more concerned about. And you'll notice if you follow the channel that I run my scope cameras not like this, not straight up and down. I usually run them on an angle like this. The reason for this is I want to keep a clear line of sight when I'm using my scopes for my elevation turret. That's very important for me to see during my matches, but I can't run it completely on an angle like 90 degrees because that would interfere with my bolt handle. I also can't run it on the other side because I have sort of all my data is on the left side of my rifle when I'm competing. I have my bubble levels, you know, I got my send it level here that I'm referencing all the time. This little tab here is where I stick my dope card. So I'm looking at numbers here, my bubble levels here, and then on my rifle chassis, I have my timer on the chassis on the left side as well. So I'm always referencing information on the left side of my scope, which means I can't run this camera like this because it'd be blocking a lot of that. So the only position I can run my cameras on is on an angle like this. And this battery, this really big battery, just gives me even less space to work with because of my bolt handle coming up on my rifle. User replaceable battery is awesome. That's something that the Triggercam didn't have. Now, I've never had any issues with the Triggercam because I remember to charge it. And I'm not so much concerned about the longevity of batteries. Modern day lithium rechargeable batteries are quite good, to be honest. Obviously, they do have a set life of how many cycles they can take, which kind of sucks if it's internal like this and not user replaceable. But on the Scopemate S18, they've used a fairly standard 18650, which is great because I actually have quite a few 18650s from back in the day when I used to do a lot of camping and like EDC stuff. A lot of my flashlights used 18650. So these are easy to source. You can even buy wall chargers and have, you know, a bunch of them in your backpack. Why this is important to me personally is when I go to multi-day events, a lot of, you know, 2-3 day events, you can just charge a bunch of these and have them in your backpack. It's just one less thing to charge overnight. Whereas the Triggercam, I have forgotten to charge at times. So on the second day of an event, I'll, you know, have to plug it into my car as I'm driving there. Whereas this one's nice because you can just have spare batteries and you can charge multiples at the same time. And if this battery were for any reason dead, like unchargeable, you could just replace it, which is awesome. I like that. Again, the cap is a little bit cheap and the O-ring on it is fairly exposed and it gets crushed fairly significantly when you close this thing, but you do get 2 spares. So I like that. I don't know how they could have done it better to be less bulky. It's just how it has to be since they used an 18650. If they had a proprietary battery that could be smaller and housed in it, that'd be cool, but then it's proprietary. So you sort of have to pick and choose. I think for what it is, they couldn't have done much better. All right, the mounting of the camera is basically the same as the Triggercam. They use those plastic shims so you can space out different scopes. You just use one of these shims. Let me get one here. Use one of these shims, put it over the ocular of your scope, and then that fits better into the S18 so that you can clamp down on it. Also, it's interesting to note that the Triggercam and the Scopemate both accept the same maximum diameter for your scopes, which is 48 millimeters. I know the Triggercam had some troubles fitting on really large scopes like the ZCO and some Collis models. So I would assume that would be the same for the Scopemate S18. 48 millimeters is what they list on their website. I measured them both quickly and they're right around there. General user interface on these is quite intuitive. The buttons stick out, which I don't love. I actually like the fact that they're recessed on the Triggercam, again, just how I use it. But everything works as they should. It's just a long hold press on the power button. The green light comes on, and then a single press. I don't have an SD card in right now, but a single press on the video to start and stop, and then press and hold on the Wi-Fi button to connect to your phone. The little cover here is just rubber, so you can just kind of pull it up with your fingers, and it exposes the charging port, which is also a data port if you want to transfer your files that way. Again, USB-C, and your micro SD card up at the top as well. The app is also quite good. I didn't have any issues with the app. I can connect to it reliably, and I can see live video footage when I need to. Usually, again, how I use these, I just use the live video footage initially to focus the camera to my diopter setting on a scope to focus the reticle, and then I usually don't really have to touch it after that. So I don't use the app connected very often, but you can also change a lot of your camera settings on the app, and I found most of them to work. There's a few that don't do anything, which is strange. Maybe they're doing updates for that, but the app generally works quite well, and it's also very intuitive. There is a feature that is recoil activated recording, which I didn't even test because I believe that would be much more for hunters and things like that. So you could have this sort of in a standby mode. You're waiting for a deer in a blind, you finally take the shot, and this thing will automatically record video before and after to give you what you want. Again, not really what I need. The Scopemate S18 also does record audio, but it's terrible. I've had some pretty cheap cameras before, and none of them have produced as poor audio quality as this thing. However, some is better than none. But if you're relying on this to be your main source of audio for a video, you're going to be severely disappointing. It is borderline unusable, but I use the audio most importantly in these Triggercams to sync video footage, because I usually have my mic on my camera, which is my main audio source, but to sync the video out of my scope camera to the video on my camera, which I overlay often, I use audio to do that. So it's nice that this has audio because I just match the peaks, and that's it. So, but again, don't rely on this for like voice recordings or things. You're not going to hear anything at all. You hear, it's like if you had earplugs on and then all the audio you wanted to hear was in another room. That's how not great the audio is on this. All right, lastly, let's talk about price point, because obviously that's a huge factor for people. So let's start with the Triggercam. Again, everything changes in terms of price. I went on some American dealers right now websites, and this thing goes for about 600 to 640 USD. So it's not cheap, but it's a great camera, and I think it's worth every penny. I really do. And I have no relationship to Triggercam. This one here is $340 right now from the Scopemate website. 340 US versus 600, let's say $620, which is quite a difference. I actually think this one, if it works for you, if all the features that I mentioned can work for you based on how you would use it, it's a good option for $340. The Scopemate is a usable scope camera, and it can produce very good video footage, especially for center fire distances, which I've talked about, but generally it's cheaper. It has a lesser quality sensor. The colors you're going to have to work with in post-production to bring to life a little bit, and just generally it's a cheaper product that you're going to have to work with harder to get usable video footage. The Triggercam, it's much more hassle-free. It just sort of works and it produces great video quality. But if the features that I mentioned, like the battery, the little bit more robust clamp, and this external focus wheel is important to you, or would work better for your use case, I think the Scopemate is a very viable option for some. Or if you just want to use it as a training tool, if you don't even care about making content and you just want to see how you shoot and what you can improve on, that is also something I think the Scopemate would do very well. So I don't know how long this video ended up being. I think it's quite long. but I wanted to make sure I covered all the points because I've been testing this thing for quite some time. And Scopemate has also been sort of hounding me for this review as well. Again, I don't have a like official relationship with them because I bought this thing with my own money. I was willing to work with them because I didn't realize this thing was basically still in R&D when they sent it to me. So, you know, they sent me a few different revisions. I've had 4 different units. I've tested it, given them feedback, and they've made improvements on it. So I really wanted to give this thing a fair shot and tell you my honest opinions on it. Lastly, I do want to mention, because I did give them obviously honest feedback, they said they are coming out with another scope camera that's going to be a higher end version. So it's going to be, they said, the S28. So this is the S18. The S28 is going to be more in line to be a competitor with the Triggercam in terms of the camera sensor and just the overall quality. Because again, the S18, it's good, not great. You get what you pay for. But I personally would be quite interested if they implemented some features in a higher end version of it, basically. So anyway, I hope the video was helpful. And if you stuck around to the end, thank you. I appreciate that. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Take care. Cheers.